Hi everyone, we're going to wait for a couple more people to get on, and then we're going to go ahead and start. All right, my name is Alicia Olguin. I'm a Conservation Nebraska director serving the Southwest region of Nebraska. I want to thank you guys for joining us today. Today we're going to be going over soil health and food production and how they go hand in hand. Before we start though, some things that you might need to know if you're new to webinars is Conservation Nebraska started ground program in 2016, and it educates students all over the state through members. Now, I am one of those conservation directors. And then for the webinar, once the webinar is done, you will leave the tab open and will pop up a survey. Please take the survey. It helps us measure our outreach and it helps with grant reporting. And then during the presentation, if you have any questions, please type those in the Q&A option, or you can put them in the chat. And you want to direct those questions in the chat to the panel and all attendees. And we will be taking questions at the end. And then I want to also thank RSP CAT for partnering with us and spending time to discuss soil health with us. So to introduce CAT, CAT is a Cropping Systems Extension Educator for Southwest Nebraska, based in McCook. CAT's background and work focuses on integrated crops, live production, and increasing farm sustainability. So go ahead and take it away, Kat.
All right, hi everybody. I'll start off with sharing my screen. So we'll jump right into the presentation. And if you have any trouble hearing me, please just put that in the chat so we'll try to get it squared away. Okay, so you should all be seeing my title screen now. So I'll introduce myself a little bit more. My name is Kat. I am the Cropping Systems Educator. So I cover 4 of our Southwest counties. So my background is actually pretty diverse. I've gotten chances to work in a couple of different regions across the country and really focus on how we can improve long-term farm sustainability using cover crops and livestock management and our basic soil health principles. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Again, feel free to put any questions you have into the chat box or the Q&A. We'll get them at the end. So before we get into soil health, I kind of want to talk about these trophic levels. And if you kind of take a second and think all the way back to maybe middle school or high school, whenever you last took your biology class, we want to think about our food web and how energy actually moves through our environments. And agriculture is a part of the environment. We've started to call it agroecology, even just because it's a very managed ecosystem. So our primary form of energy on Earth is the sun. It's solar energy, and our primary producers, so those are plants and algae that are capable of photosynthesizing. So these are the only creatures on the planet that are able to take solar energy and convert it into carbohydrates and physical structures. So these primary producers and our plants are really the basis of all life on Earth. So our primary consumers, so those are our herbivores like cattle, buffalo, elk, deer, rabbits, sheep, goats, whatever you want to pick for today, whatever you like to eat the most, are our primary consumers. So those are the ones who directly eat the plants. And then us as people, we're typically secondary consumers. So we eat the things that eat the plants. But all of this food production is based on plants. It's based on the ability of plants to convert solar energy into physical matter, which is all linked to soil productivity. So 95% of our food production, our plants, are grown in soil as their growing medium. We do have things like hydroponics and aquaponics, which are artificial growing mediums with synthetic nutrients, but that is not our dominant form. The dominant form of agriculture is using soil as our growing medium. So soil plays a really important role in having continued food production on our planet. So the soil web is just like that bigger food web. It's just like that above ground food web. And if you've seen me talk about soil health before, you've probably heard me give this exact spiel before, that we have this really complex ecosystem underground. So again, our first trophic level, those primary producers are our plants. Those are those plants converting solar energy into root biomass, leaf biomass. And then past our roots and our photosynthesizers, we have a lot of different critters in the soil. We have primary consumers, so that secondary trophic level, so things like fungi and nematodes that directly interact with the roots of the plants. Then we have slightly bigger critters that eat those critters, all the way up to birds and, again, animals. So it's really important to think about soil as not just a static element in our environment, but something that's as equally dynamic as our really diverse, wonderful ecosystems above ground. So what's actually in soil? What actually is soil before we talk about soil health? You might hear your local NRCS person correct you from saying dirt, saying it's soil, but soil is a lot more complex than just dirt. So we have those critters again, those really cool different nematodes, fungi in the soil. We also have small soil particles. So those are smaller matters, kind of like clay, that dust that blows around in the air, a lot in Southwest Nebraska. We also have larger soil particles, and these soil particles interact with each other differently. They interact with the critters differently, and they create their own little micro ecosystems on the surface of their soil particles. We also have air and water. So we want our soil to have the ability to respire, even to have gas exchange from the above ground atmosphere into the soil. We want water to be able to move through our soil. So think about a really waterlogged clay soil, just that muck. You don't have a lot of water and air moving through there, so you can create an oxygen deprived environment because there's no air, it's just water, and a lot of those microorganisms require oxygen to live and function. But there are some soils that are adapted to being waterlogged. So think about the Everglades in Florida. The mangrove trees have evolved to survive in a waterlogged area, but typically in our agroecosystems, we want our soil to be able to have water percolate through and to have air and gases exchange with the atmosphere. So we have fungus. We're learning a lot more about mycorrhizal fungi, and it's becoming a lot more well known kind of in our general conversation around agriculture. So we're actually learning in forests that trees will have these beneficial associations with fungus in the ground, and they're very small, thin fungus. Don't think big mushrooms, think little tiny tendrils moving between the plants. And trees will actually have associations with this fungus and can communicate with each other by sending different signals down this fungus. And we're coming to know more and more about the fungus that live in our agroecosystems and live in our crop grounds, and that we can get some additional nutrients, and we can get some really good benefits from encouraging this population, encouraging growth of this fungus. And we also have roots. Roots is another thing we kind of think of as a static part of the plants, because we have house plants, they grow in a pot, we think the roots are just there. But roots are actually really dynamic. They're constantly growing, constantly putting down new biomass, growing new cells. A plant root hair only lives for about 24 hours before those cells are sloughed off of the root and then enter the soil and become part of the environment. Excuse me. So our soil texture, those actual particles, so that's the actual minimal kind of dirt, gritty part of the soil, have a big size range. So if we think about our largest particles of sand, we all know what sand looks like if we think about going to the beach or the desert. Think of the sand in scale as a beach ball, so about that big. Our next size smaller particle is silt, which is about the size of a golf ball, right? So that's a big difference from a beach ball to a golf ball. And then our next size smaller is clay. So I didn't make this size, actually from a really great researcher at the University of Wisconsin, but I just so happened to use Bare Minerals makeup. And think about how finely milled powder makeup is. So if you use it yourself or someone in your household use it, think about just how fine that is and how it can kind of stick to every surface of your bathroom counter. That's the size difference between a sand particle and a clay particle. So how those particles interact with each other and how they interact with water critters can really be very different and vary a lot. So that soil texture can alter the properties of our soil. So how gas is exchanged, how it stacks up with each other. We can affect the properties of the soil, but we can't alter the space texture, right? So we can't change that proportion of particle sizes to each other in kind of whatever soil we're upon. So the soil in Utah is much different than the soil in Colorado, if we want to think of it that way. Think of that sand versus more silt and clay. So our soil types are defined as our relative proportion of sand, silt, and clay. So we're kind of down on this bottom section, Southwest Nebraska. We have some very sandy soils and some loamy soils. to soils that typically lose water very quickly and kind of see heat stress a bit faster on our crops. But so these physical traits of our soils can really affect both the physical and non-physical interactions that happen with our soils and with our crops. So our water availability is impacted by our soil type. So think about how quickly water will drain through sand versus water if you dump it on top of a brick. So brick is made of clay. How quickly water is going to move through that. Compaction, so how quickly or how not quickly or how easily our soils can become compacted. These structures of our soils and how quickly we can build soil structure or lose soil structure, along with bulk density. So bulk density is how much soil is in a given volume. So high bulk density means our soil is compacted. A low bulk density means we have good air pockets and good soil structure and space for water to move through. And how our soil, what our soil type is, will also affect our porosity. So how much space is within that soil, which affects our water and our air movement. So in Nebraska, again, I'm based out of McCook, so I spend a lot of time in Southwest Nebraska, and that's where a lot of my my perspective comes from. Forgot that word for a second. So Nebraska is actually made up of several different prairie types. There is both short grass prairie and tall grass prairie. And Nebraska is also split straight down the middle by the 100th meridian line. So that 100th meridian is pretty much that line that defines where the rain shadow of the Rockies is. So as we move further east, we typically have greater precipitation. And as we move west, the line kind of hits right on Grand Island. So if you notice when you drive west of Grand Island, you start going up in elevation, which is associated with reduced rainfall, and you're kind of entering more into the high Great Plains rather than just the Great Plains of the Midwest. So because of this, a lot of western Nebraska has extremely limited rainfall. There's something like almost a 10-inch difference between the two sides of the state, depending on the year. So because of this, we have both dryland and irrigated cropping systems. And I spend a lot of time talking about dryland crops and deficit irrigation, how we can reduce our water use. And we also have a lot of sand and loamy soils, and a lot of sandy soils. But we have to remember that this wasn't natively a prairie ecosystem. It did have a pretty deep, rich top layer of soil that was made up of a lot of really good soil organic matter that was pretty productive. If we think about the sandhills of Nebraska, even when they're in bad years, they're still relatively productive grass systems. So to kind of wrap up the soil portion of this, the pedosphere is our entire sphere of how soil interacts with our other spheres on Earth. Just like we have the atmosphere, we have the sphere around the soil. So soil interacts with the atmosphere. We have gas exchanged, carbon dioxide, oxygen, different forms of nitrogen. We are spending a lot of time kind of in the common areas of even policy now discussing how we can sequester CO2 into the soil as soil organic carbon, how we can use cropping systems to do that. Interacts with the biosphere, obviously. I mean, that's plants, animals, microbes. That includes us. We use soil for a lot of things. The lithosphere, so minerals, different clay types, so on and so forth. That's really what that parent material of our pedosphere is. And the hydrosphere, so that's water and how water moves through the soil and how different substances can be dissolved into our water systems by moving through the soil. So we've been having some concerns with nitrate contamination in our waters in Nebraska. And part of that is because we put down a lot of nitrogen fertilizers for our crops, and that's lost and leached into our water system. We also live right on top of the Ogallala Aquifer, which is one of the major water sources for cropping systems in the Western United States, and how we can preserve and better utilize soil health to maintain the Ogallala Aquifer and pump less water from it. So what is soil health? A lot of different groups are talking about soil health, and they all kind of like to use their own words to define it. This is a great definition. This is one of my favorite definitions from the Soil Health Nexus, which is a group of land-grant universities and extension from those land-grant universities who are trying to develop good resources for producers to adopt on their farms. But really it comes down to keeping the soil capable of functioning as a living organism to continue our food production, to continue making it a viable resource for years to come. So we like to operate with the 5 principles of soil health. These are kind of the tenets that have been adopted by the NRCS, and the NRCS has been doing a lot of great work to get soil health out on farms and get soil conservation practices out on farms. So they're pretty simply defined as armoring the soil, minimizing soil disturbance, having increased plant diversity, having a continual living root in the ground, and the integration of livestock into our cropping systems. So armoring the soil is just what it sounds like. It's having something on the soil more or less year-round, having some form of crop residue to protect that soil from the elements, so including like heavy rains, flooding, wind and snow erosion. So this is a picture of a no-till field of soybeans that has actually been cultivated, but still has a really nice rye cover crop residue that's protecting that soil, moderating the temperature, keeping it a good climate for some of those microorganisms and insects that live there. Minimizing soil disturbance is tillage. So this doesn't have to be a never-till system. We spend a lot of time encouraging the adoption of no-till systems, but tillage can play a good role. Tillage can really support weed control in some situations and help with soil moisture management. So a lot of times here we're talking about maybe using conservation tillage, just reducing that very heavy moldboard plow or chisel plow operations, maybe reducing it from every year to once every 5 years to kind of promote some of that soil health and soil structure building, and really kind of encourage some better environments for our beneficial insect populations. So this doesn't necessarily mean never till, but it just means minimizing your tillage and minimizing your soil disturbance. Also including plant diversity. So not just doing our monoculture corn on corn on corn every year, increasing the amounts of plants that we actually get out onto our crop fields and into our environments. So this is one of my favorite pictures from when I was working in Pennsylvania, and this is a strip cropping system. So if you look at the bottom here, it's actually a strip of a perennial forage crop, and then above that is corn. Further up the hill, there will be soybeans, and those strips rotate every several years. So any water or erosion loss that could occur from that slope when it rains and comes down is caught by those perennial forage strips and held in the field. We don't see this management strategy used a lot in Western Nebraska. A lot of our crop fields are relatively flat, and it's mostly our rangeland that's really hilly, but you'll see strip cropping as a fairly common practice kind of towards eastern states. If you go into Iowa or Pennsylvania, you'll see this relatively frequently out on the landscape to kind of control our erosion on our hills. Also having a continual living root in the ground. So this could be incorporating a perennial forage into your cropping system. So it could be doing alfalfa and orchard grass or timothy hay. So this is a picture from western Kansas, so down by the Oberlin area, so not too far at all from McCook, of a winter-killed cover crop. There's a few green things out there still. There's some turnip and forage radish that are helping keep the soil fed, helping provide environments during those winter months. Actually, this acted as a great snow catch when the snow came through and was blowing through western Kansas, which get the same wonderful winds that western Nebraska does. It was really catching the snow and keeping it on that soil surface and adding a little bit of extra soil moisture to that system. So this was a pretty hardy cover crop. I have a kind of average height border collie, and he was having a lot of fun galloping through this. And this picture was actually taken in January. So it stands for a long time. That's really beneficial to holding and preserving our soils. And then finally, integrating livestock. We have a lot of cattle around in Nebraska, which I enjoy driving by and seeing them. So it can really simply be just getting our cattle back out on the landscape and getting them back onto crop fields. It doesn't have to be an intensive grazing system necessarily, but we know that these soil health sort of indicators that we see, they accelerate at a greater rate when we integrate livestock into our cropping systems. So we see our soil structure and organic matter and our the fatty acids associated with bacteria that we want in the soil really increase at a much greater rate when we include all of those previous soil health kind of ideas along with livestock. So not every farmer wants to graze their field, not every farmer wants to have cattle, and that's fine. It could also look like incorporating manure into your fertilization system, or using compost or some other form of livestock byproduct to get that back out on the land and into our soils. And finally, not all healthy soils look the same. So I am natively an East Coast girl, and I spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania, and this is a picture of a soil profile from a deciduous temperate forest. And you can see the soils are much, much different in color than our soils in Nebraska are. And that layer on top is much, much richer and much deeper than what our prairie soils might look like. And this is largely associated with the fact that it's much wetter in that part of the country. It sees a lot more precipitation than we do. And what's kind of fun working with soil health is a lot of these ideas and these kind of gold standards that we want to achieve were developed in specific regions of the country. So soil health is a lot like our own health. It doesn't look the same everywhere. And sometimes we have to find strategies that have common ground with other people, but work best in our system and kind of function better with our soils. So not every management strategy I've learned about in Pennsylvania is going to translate to Southwest Nebraska, but the same basic ideas do. And this is kind of just a fun picture. I really enjoy hiking in southern Utah. And this is a picture of biological soil crust from one of the national parks there. And what's really cool is it's the desert, it's the high desert in Utah, right? So it's very sandy soils, very coarse, it's a very harsh environment, extremely moisture limited, it only gets a couple of inches of rain very quickly at certain times of the year. But the bacteria living in the sand, living in the soil, wants to create soil, it wants to create an environment that it can grow and thrive in. So it will actually reach out and multiply, and when they die, they will stick together those soil particles. And this really just kind of shows how resilient those bacteria are and how resilient our soils are. It wants to create this healthy system. It wants to resist sort of that harsh conditions, even to the point that it created a beneficial enough environment that a little cactus is growing in there. So it's kind of fun. Our soils want to be resilient and they want to be hardy. And we can just help encourage that, and it can really benefit our production and our farmers. So our Nebraska cropping systems, you might have noticed if you've ever driven around our state, we grow a lot of row crops, and I'm a trained agronomist, and I really enjoy working in these crops, but a lot of those crops don't enter the human food supply chain. A lot of them, like our corn and soybeans, they go more towards our livestock production, our fiber production. We have a lot of ethanol production. There's one right up the road from me in Trenton, you know, and that's good. It helps our economy thrive, but we kind of have multiple crop streams within our system. A lot of times we're talking about soil health, we're talking about our big agronomic farms and how we can have the biggest impact on the landscape. We do produce some food that does go into the human consumption stream. So things like popcorn, sugar beets will be processed into sugar, dry beans. A lot of our wheat is used for different baked good products, and we grow several different types of wheat in Nebraska, and we're working on some agronomic practices to adopt spring wheat, which is really exciting. Field peas, a lot of our sorghum goes into pet food and bird seed production, and we also have sunflower production. A lot of our sunflower is oilseed type. It goes to be sunflower oil versus confectionery seed. So confectionery type sunflowers is what you'd buy in the grocery store if you're just looking for a snack or you see sunflowers in your bread. We do have some small scale fruit and vegetable production. This is typically more associated with the eastern side of the state where we have a little bit higher of a population, but we do have some really cool stuff in the western side, in kind of some of our small towns. We also grow a lot of forages. We grow a lot of forage sorghum, alfalfa, different types of hay. We have a lot of cattle and a lot of horses that we have to feed, and they are herbivores. Those are those primary consumers. So we spend a lot of energy growing things to feed other things and livestock. So we have a lot of cow-calf operations, and we also have a lot of feedlots in the state. We also have a growing poultry industry. We've been seeing a lot in the news about those Costco plants that are coming up and the contracts that farmers are getting to build broiler houses and grow birds for Costco on the eastern side of the state. So poultry has a digestive system that's completely different from cattle. It's more similar to our digestive system or swine's digestive system. So we're going to see an increased demand of soybean and corn on that side of the state to meet the demand of this growing poultry industry. But again, a lot of the crops we grow do go primarily to livestock feed or fuel. So on the edge of our living memory in Nebraska, we know what poor soil health looks like. We know the implications of what happens if we don't conserve our soils and try to don't conserve our natural resources. The Dust Bowl is on the edge of our living memory. We do have people in our communities who can remember this when they were growing up, and the Dust Bowl was really a result of very, very heavy tillage, a droughty conditions, and then those winds. And the Dust Bowl is actually kind of what sparked the formation of a lot of our natural resource conservation groups, including the NRCS, is to really try to stem off seeing this in the future. And what's kind of heartbreaking when we see soil blowing around even today, and I've seen it blowing in the winter, blowing through valleys in the panhandle, we still struggle with this, is that's your growing medium. That's what you're going to put your crops in. That's what's going to feed your crops and what's going to keep your farm viable years to come. So it is really important to conserve our soil, especially under the challenging growing conditions we have in Western Nebraska. There's been a study done in 2019 that shows that corn production does have a negative impact on air quality. It's not to say corn production is bad, that's just saying a lot of particulate matter gets blown up into the air and can impact our respiratory systems as a result of corn production. I mean, there's a lot of dirt blowing around when we drive equipment through the fields. We have emissions when we drive that equipment through the fields, and we also have a lot of dust just coming off the corn itself. If you've ever been out during wheat harvest, you can kind of get that feeling of like you're breathing in the wheat chaff while you're standing by the combine. So it's an environmental impact, especially for our communities that are associated with our farming operations and are very close to those harvests. So why would a farmer want to use soil health? Well, it's resource conservation. At the end of the day, we're preventing soil loss and soil erosion, and we're really trying to benefit fertility management. A lot of our soil fertility is what feeds our crop and is a huge expense on farms. So soils kind of require a baseline amount of nutrients in order to function, in order to feed that ecosystem and to cycle nutrients how they would naturally want to, and to continue kind of chugging along as a functioning soil. So crops remove nutrients. Kind of makes sense, right? They have to grow up, and then we take the plants literally out of the field. We take that yield away from the fields. So we have really good agronomic knowledge. We know almost exactly how much of each nutrient a crop will remove based on how much it will yield. So if we can improve our nutrient cycling, if we can improve our soil fertility through soil health, we'll have the ability to maintain that baseline amount of nutrients in the soil, and then only have to fertilize to replace what that crop will need and what that crop will take away. So over time, that can really decrease the amount of off-farm inputs we need through our fertilizer. And we can also use things like compost and different types of manure to offset some of those fertilizer costs and some of those synthetic fertilizers. We can increase our soil organic matter a lot faster that way, just through having that nutrient cycling and having that compost and manure on the ground. And I like to use a lot of pictures to demonstrate points. This is a picture from when I was teaching some college students, and that whole container of soil that was completely filled with growing medium, so kind of like potting soil you could buy in the store, that is just grass roots. That is just some forage grass, not a heavy seeding rate. It was pretty lightly just sprinkled on there. And that whole container of soil is just held together with your roots. So think about what that difference could make on a farming operation, just having some perennial grasses out there, and how much you can hold that soil there and not have it blow away. Those poor kids had to wash all the soil out and measure how much root mass was actually there, and they were less impressed with how well the soil was held in there by the roots after they had to wash it all out, but they had fun. They were fine. Just like soil health doesn't look the same, soil management won't even look the same across the entire farm. Management might differ from field to field, and it's going to differ between our cropland and our rangeland. So we have a pretty good mix of cropland and rangeland in Southwest Nebraska, but our croplands are typically very productive. They're grass prairie ecosystems, but we're seeing this invasion of the eastern red cedar trees. So eastern red cedar trees, while they make fantastic wind buffers, I'm not saying rip out your wind buffers, when they get out onto the landscape and kind of proliferate everywhere, they use a lot of water. They take up a lot of water from our ecosystems. They take a lot of water away from the grasses. So what we're starting to see happen is the grass productivity and how much grass is actually there is declining while we see this increase of eastern red cedars. simply because there isn't enough moisture there for them to grow. So if we don't have as much grass out there, we can't feed as many cattle. You can't feed as many cattle out there. You have to buy more land. You might have to cut your herd back, and you're really hurting the productivity and the profitability of your operation. So even our soil management here doesn't necessarily have to be what we're planting or how we're not tilling. It's simply managing the plants that's out on the landscape. So our soil management, our water management is going to look different at different places on our farming operations. So how can soil health really give you opportunities? For one, it increases your weed control opportunities. Having a plant constantly out there on this landscape will increase plant competition. A lot of our weed species are kind of wimpy when it comes to plant competition, so that will kind of knock them back and make our synthetic fertilizers a bit more, our herbicides a bit more effective. We don't want to fertilize the weeds. Diverse cropping rotation offers you more marketing opportunities, more opportunities to try some niche products, get some premium prices for those. It'll also kind of encourage more diverse overall farming operations. I've been talking a lot about how we can make resilient farms, resilient against weather and economic situations. We were fortunate not to get hit by the flooding last year, but we still saw farms really impacted by the wet conditions and those cold conditions that impacted our calf crop last year. So we know that our farms that have more diverse operations on the farm itself are more resilient to weather conditions and market changes. And we want our farms to be resilient. We want them to continue farming and growing. If we see soil health practices, we typically see a decrease in off-farm inputs over time. So things like our synthetic fertilizers, our herbicide products. And then we also typically see a decrease in long-term costs. If you go from a system of heavy tillage and a lot of fertilizers to no-till, we typically see a decrease in our production costs just because you're not using as much equipment. You're not having to use as much gas to drive across the field and do multiple trips. You kind of reduce that down to one. We also see improved water quality. We get to filter the water a little bit more. We retain a bit more of those nutrients in the system, and we're not necessarily having to pull as much water from the aquifer. If we're using something like a deficit irrigation system, or we're using crops that require less water overall. And we know that the more water we pull from the aquifer, the more we tend to contaminate that water, and that's going to become an increasing issue in the future. So this is a picture that's actually pretty cool. These farmers are really, really good at residue management. They had probably, I want to say, at least about ½ inch of residue sitting on that field, and he came in and was planting spring wheats back in March. So I was out riding along with him, and that soil temperature was a little bit colder than other fields, but they have really good residue management, a lot of soil organic matter. So when we got into those really hot, dry conditions last month, their wheat was still looking pretty green, and the soil wasn't in increased temperature. It was still pretty cool, and the wheat looked fantastic. They did have some slight decreases in yields, but they didn't necessarily see that drastic decrease that some of our other farmers are seeing in their wheat crop right now. So if soil health is so great, why isn't everybody doing it? There's no one answer. It's a complicated issue. There's no simple answers for complicated issues. There's a lot of social, emotional, and economic factors that go into the adoption of new practices. It's really cool to see a lot of ag research is now incorporating sociologists into it to try to understand what we actually need to provide to producers to encourage adoption, or how we can support producers who've already begun to use these practices. We also see issues with resource and input availability. So a lot of producers use GMO seeds, and that's fine. I'm not against GMO seeds. I think they're actually very useful in our systems. But a farmer might opt to plant conventional seeds. So that's a seed that doesn't have a trait in it to resist a herbicide or an insect. They're just kind of typical seeds, like you might buy a vegetable seed. Well, conventional seeds for planting aren't grown in a great extent as GMO seeds are. So if you don't have access to those seeds, you can't plant them, obviously. So maybe if you don't get your seed order in soon enough, or you miss it, you don't have the option of planting a conventional seed that year. We also have current issues in our marketing and pricing challenges. So there's limited options to get a premium on your crop. So we have premiums for organic agricultural products, but we don't necessarily have them for these quote soil health or sustainably produced products. So the conventional seed, maybe you want to opt away from a GMO seed. You can produce it conventionally, maybe you put some more labor into it to keep it weed-free or disease-free, but you don't get a price increase back at the end of the year when you want to market that crop. A lot of time these crops, especially if we're doing a niche crop, like something like cereal rye, you have to market beyond the local elevator. We can get you to plant as many different things as we want, but if you have nowhere to sell it, it's not going to catch on and producers won't increase production of it across the area. And I mean, at the end of the day, farms are businesses. Farms need to have a net profitability and return to remain sustainable over time and to move on to the next generation and continue to be productive. And change is hard. Change doesn't happen overnight. This is a picture of one of my own failures. And this can example why change can be so difficult and trying a new management strategy can be so difficult. So I had planted a cover crop study out at the Stump International Wheat Research Farm. It's a very long name, never remember it all. But it's a University of Nebraska research farm over in Grants, so very similar growing conditions to McCook. I planted a cover crop study at the end of last summer. It was designed that it would overwinter, it would kill during the winter, but we had some challenges with the study and I kind of abandoned it. And I told the farm manager, oh, just kill it when you plant corn, it'll be fine. I'm not going to collect data from it, whatever. So if you look at this picture in the foreground, these light green, kind of sad looking corn plants is where the cover crops were. And in the background, these really dark, nice looking corn plants is where the cover crops were not. And they use typical management strategies. Well, I got a call from another educator that I should go look at this corn. And I think what happened is that those cover crops were let grow. They grew into the spring. They completed a full crop cycle. Some of them even headed out and had little seeds on the top of them, but they used up a lot of the moisture and they used up a lot of the nutrients that were needed for the corn. So I did not manage those correctly. And when we're encouraging adoption, oftentimes we encourage baby steps. For me, it's sad to look at because the corn looks sad, but I'm not taking a financial hit from this. I'm learning something from it. But imagine if you're a producer and you're putting that risk out there and you're taking that risk on yourself and you try that on a 200-acre field and this happens to you. That's a big financial hit. So finding a management strategy that works for you and works for your operation and works for that field can be very risky and it can be very challenging. And a lot of times it's little baby steps. A lot of times we see a producer try something new, go full bore all the way in on it, and it fails. That producer is not likely to try that strategy again, and his neighbors or her neighbors aren't likely to try it either. You know, somebody up the road tried it and it failed 10 years ago. Why should I try and take that risk on myself? So who besides Extension is out here talking about soil health? A lot of people. It's very exciting to see. So then there's the Soil Health Nexus. So that's a group of land-grant universities. And there's some private groups like the Soil Health Institute and the Land Grant Institute. The Land Grant Institute is actually really cool. It's a group of researchers down in Kansas, and they're studying a lot of perennial wheat cropping systems and perennial sunflower systems. So how we can get more perennial plants on the landscape and have them as a ag commodity crop. So there's a lot of really cool stuff coming out of there. And we're also starting to see some of our food companies really get on board with this idea of sustainable sourcing. So food companies can produce food sustainably. They can reduce their waste in their factories, but that doesn't always translate to how that commodity that they're buying from farmers is actually produced. So General Mills is one of the big ones that's been talking a lot about sustainably sourcing their grains. And a few years ago, and last year too, Annie's, which is owned by General Mills, had these really cool boxes out for some of their products that talked about the importance of soil health and the importance of farming sustainably and really encouraging soil health. So it's really cool for me as an agronomist to see this getting on the shelves and getting more people talking about it and thinking about how our grains and how our commodity crops are actually grown. So how does this all differ from some of the labels you actually see in the grocery store? And I get a lot of questions about the USDA organic label. And a lot of my family is not involved with agriculture, and I will get a phone call at least once or twice a year saying like, hey, what does this new label mean? And what's the difference between organic and natural? And it's sometimes like a word soup, and I have to look it up myself sometimes. So the USDA organic label certifies that the product was produced under standards that were set by the USDA organic program. So this simply means that there's a big book of the organic standards that you met those requirements. This doesn't necessarily mean that you're using great soil health practices. It really comes down to that you're producing that food without synthetic fertilizers and without synthetic herbicides. So there are organic pesticides and there are organic fertilizers. They are typically made of naturally sourced materials rather than synthetically produced materials, but organic farmers still have that option. To what level? There are a lot of really good soil health principles and practices and sustainability practices in the organic standards, but to the extent the farms actually implement those varies from farm to farm. It's like any other farm using any other method. So the USDA organic label really is a marketing program. It's so that that product can carry that USDA label and get sold for a higher premium at a higher price. We do have agreements with other countries. So especially with the EU and Canada, we have reciprocal labeling programs so that any products that's produced under their label program will meet the requirements of the USDA label. We're also seeing more and more private labeling programs come up. So the big two examples I could think of is the Certified Humane label and the Non-GMO Project labels. So these are private organizations that set their own standards. Whole Foods kind of does this now too. They set their own standards and they generally acquire some form of inspection from their organization of a farming operation. If you meet the standards of their organizations, they will certify you to use that label. So you can now put on your carton of eggs, these are certified humane raised, and charge whatever premium you would like for them. Or you can put on your bag of rice, non-GMO project, and it just certifies that you meet the standards of that group. These labels can kind of become counterproductive because we don't have GMO products for a lot of things that non-GMO labels are put on. I bought a bag of arborio rice at the store last week to make risotto, and it had a non-GMO product label on it. There are no GMO arborio rice strains, so it's not even possible for it to be a GMO product in the first place. So some of these labels really aren't for production guarantees, they really are a marketing strategy. So when we're talking about sustainable agriculture, it's always kind of important to think through what the practices and what those labels really are. So to wrap things up, soil management and farm management in general is like our health. It's really complex. It's not a simple checklist that we can just go through, check off those 5 things, and that's it, we're done forever. It's a really complex network of different mineral, biological, chemical, social, economic, and emotional interactions. It's hard to find a farmer who isn't somehow emotionally connected to what they farm and what they do. We really have to take an integrated approach both to our soil management and our farm management, as well as our food production, how we can connect those two both in the economics and the farming practices side. And simply adoption just does not happen overnight. We have a long way to go with soil health. We have a long way to go with our food production system in general, but Rome wasn't built today. We're seeing a lot of really good positive changes. We're seeing a lot of producers who are interested in becoming better at soil health and better at their resource management overall, but change in results take time. They take time to get there, but we're on the way. Southwest Nebraska is doing pretty good so far. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I will take a look at the question box. You can also feel free to contact me at my office or shoot me an email. I'm based at the Red Willow County Fairgrounds. So if you know where the USDA offices are in that building, you've already found the extension office. And thank you. How do I stop sharing? Oops, okay, so do you want?
Just to reiterate, or the
I think you're having a slow internet issue, Alicia. So is it okay if I just go through the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So the one question that came up was, other than soil testing, is there any way to know how healthy your soil is for growing food? So I'm going to use an extension answer. It depends. It depends on what soil you are and different situations. So if you're doing something like growing soil on a reclaimed mining site, I would probably not grow food there. There tends to be some heavy metals in the ground. Most of the soil around us is pretty safe. If you're looking to just kind of figure out what your organic matter is in the soil, you can dig up a plant. And if you look at that final slide, it had all of the soil attached to the roots. That's a pretty good indication that that soil has a high organic matter in it and is relatively healthy, because it's interacting with the roots and wanting to stick onto it. If you are looking to just find out what nutrients are in what level in your soil, a soil test is the best way to go. You can use the Cornell pH strips to test your pH if you're worried about that, but kind of the baseline to figure out really is a soil test. It's kind of the easiest way to do it. And yes, Tyler, thank you for the note on the clay. Yes, fired clay will act very differently than normal clay. It's just kind of the easiest example to give of thinking of water moving through. But yes, you're right, fired clay will act very different than natural clay. So the efficiency of organic farming versus conventional farming in building a healthy and resilient soil system. So that really comes down to the producer and what methods the producer is using. So if you have an organic producer who is relying a lot on tillage as their primary form of weed control and are doing multiple passes of tillage in a year, even if they're applying organic matter through compost or manure, you're still doing a lot of destruction to that soil through all of that tillage. It would be the same thing as if a conventional farmer was using extremely heavy tillage practices and then doing something like an eco-fallow and spraying out a lot of weeds and then going back and tilling again. We also have a lot of conventional farms that are really heavily invested in building their soil health. So they still use tools like synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, but they're using no-till systems. They're increasing the amount of residue on their farm. And they're using cover crops and livestock in their system. So it really depends on the strategy of the farmer. Organic versus conventional, a lot of our soil health principles and our soil health strategies are exactly the same. It really comes down to if you want to use a synthetic fertilizer and a herbicide and a pesticide as an additional tool versus not. I've seen farms that are both organic and conventional that are really successful at building their soil health. And I've seen both organic and conventional farms that have done a really poor job of preserving the soils. Okay, so if there's any final questions, I'm happy to answer them. Again, you can feel free to email me. If not, Alicia, do you have anything else to? Oh, John has one more question. Yes, organic farmers do need to comply with the USDA organic standards when farming. I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. So the USDA organic standards, they don't define if you have to till or if you don't have to till. So there's recommended practices within the USDA organic standards, but really what the organic standards boil down to is what products you can and can't use, and what conditions you can have animals in and you may not have animals in, or what products you can use on animals, what products you cannot use on animals. So this doesn't, if you want to get into the extreme nuances of it, they don't say you have to till and you have to use compost and you have to plant a green manure cover crop. They really just say you can apply this form of fertilizer. And what you use to make up that gap of fertilizer is completely up to the individual producer. So there are organic producers who rely a lot of tillage for weed control versus a no-till conventional producer who might use a herbicide to spray that out. The organic standards really are more of a list of products you can or can't use. It doesn't necessarily define a farming strategy. How to combat soil compaction in corn country. Well, we like to say baby steps. I work with some other educators who are also working on this problem at the moment, and some of it is baby steps. You know, maybe reducing that number of tillage passes, reducing that disking to control weeds and eco-fallow systems. And it could also be do things like, using better residue management. So we like to, especially in corn country, if we don't want to graze our corn stalks, we take our stalks off and we bale them. It could be something like keeping those corn stover and keeping those stalks on the ground and keeping them there to armor the soil and to add some organic matter back to the soil. It also could be better management. A lot of times we want to farm when we want to farm. We want to go out and harvest when it's time. We want to go out and spray when it's time. And sometimes it's just not the good soil conditions. It's been particularly wet the last 2 years, and we've seen equipment out getting stuck in very soft fields, in very wet fields. And that compaction, even with our dramatic freeze-thaw systems we have, especially in the spring and winter, that compaction, if it goes very deep, if it goes at least a foot into the soil, is going to take time to work itself out. So a lot of times it's thinking about our equipment management. How can we reduce the amount of heavy equipment we're driving through the fields? How can we prevent the semi-trucks full of grain from driving down the middle of the field and compacting that soil? And a lot of times it's also introducing new crops, encouraging the adoption of a wheat or a small grain like cereal rye into the system. And sometimes those roots will get into the soil and help kind of bust up some of that deep compaction that we have from just having corn on corn on corn. So it is really using all of those soil health principles, but our baby steps kind of likes to be better residue management and better equipment management. How much does economics weigh into poor soil management? We are learning more and more about that. That is one of the realities, is how can we make our conservation practices pay for themselves? We have some cool systems coming in where people are trying to set up carbon exchanges. We actually are paying producers to grow a perennial crop and sequester some of that carbon. What we see with our poor soil management is over time, your farm expenses becomes more challenging, it becomes more difficult. So say you're now using more fertilizer than you used to use. Your fertilizer isn't as effective as it used to be, so you need to use even more fertilizer. Your soil's struggling because it's blowing away, so your corn is struggling, so you get more weeds. Now you've got to use more herbicides to control that. And one of our most effective strategies for controlling pest problems and disease problems in crops is to have a really healthy plant. That's kind of our tenet of integrated pest management. It's the same thing for us. The best way to avoid disease is to be healthy, right? So encouraging a healthy plant. If we have poor soil management, we have poor soil, our plants aren't as hardy when we plant them. They're not as prolific when we get them going in the seedling stage. We often then have to use remediation methods during season to get those plants through season and get them to yield. So overall, our inputs tend to become a bit more and more expensive the worse our soil condition tends to be. We also see those negative environmental impacts just to our communities around. Is large-scale farming worse for the soil than small-scale farming? Is there a limit to efficacy in mega farms? That is a really interesting question. So we actually know that the most economically viable and the most economic returns to the community is actually medium-sized farms. It's not mega farms, it's not those 1-acre vegetable farms, it's that couple hundred acres, a little bit in the middle, really diverse operations. And those farms tend to have the ability to have very close management because they have the time to look at all those fields and implement new strategies, versus a mega farm where some fields might not get as much attention as other fields, or those small farms that are really only producing a niche product. And we know from our ag census every 4 years, I believe, that our biggest loss in farm operations is actually those medium-sized farms. We see an increasing amount of large-scale farms, we see increasing amount of small farms, and where our decrease is those medium-sized farms, which has some implications for our communities as well. The soil part of it really comes down again to the producer. Some large operations are making it a point to improve the soil health. Some smaller operations are doing this all by hand and by horses, so they can spend a lot of time focusing on soil health. It really comes down to the producer again. Oh, we have a question from David. I have a large organic garden, but heavy clay soil. And build soil health. Okay, so that's a gardening question. So I'll do my best to answer gardening. So heavy clay soils are very difficult to manage. If you're a gardener, if you're producers, they are just difficult to manage because their water holding, it tends to really want to hold on to water and then turn into what feels like unfired bricks, right? I would suggest trying to boost up your organic matter first off. So try going with some compost. You can try doing, so one of the permacultures really enjoys doing is straw bales. So planting something into straw bales or using straw bales as your ground cover. Try to reduce any tillage that you're doing to just once a year at most. Try to do it just in the spring, and then if you can kind of avoid doing it the next year, that's great. Sometimes you can't. So I would go first by using your weed control strategy to be a really thick layer of straw. If that can start to kind of decompose over the summer and you can leave it there, great. If not, next spring you can till it in. Also try a cover crop. So red clover is a little bit difficult to get growing in our area just because of how dry and hot it is. But cereal rye is a really great cover crop, as along with triticale. Buckwheat's okay. Buckwheat is not really great for weed control. Small amounts of cover crop seed is available from things like Johnny Seeds. A lot of places sell them online. They sell them in smaller bags, so you don't have to get the 50-pound bag to put in your planter. You can get a more smaller home-based bag. You can put that cover crop out there, and that will really help compete with weeds and also be adding some carbon back to your soil. And that cover crop, you will either want to spray it out or till it in to get some of those benefits. Also, David, if you are in the North Platte area, David Lott is our horticultural educator in North Platte, and he can answer any questions in more detail on your garden. I'm sure he would be happy to help, and I can share his contact info with you.
Thank you, Kat, for uh, telling us about soil health. Sorry, I just got my more for time.
I think we lost you, Alicia.
Kat, it does look like Tyler put one more question there in the chat. So if we want to use that, we can then wrap up after that question from him.
Oh, sure. Okay. Could farmers have an exchange of some kind to move standing plants from one cornfield to another based on nutrient content? So we actually have a corn stover exchange already. It is a resource through the University of Nebraska Extension. It's run through our beef educators, and it is as basically a stover exchange. It's you put up there, I have this many acres and who wants to graze it, and a farmer looking to graze his cattle or her cattle, sorry, their cattle on corn stover over the winter can get in contact with each other. We also have a hay exchange that's kind of the same way. When we're talking about carbon and residue we can get from crops, soybean is a really poor residue leaver. It doesn't leave a lot of stem behind. It doesn't leave a lot of carbon material behind. The stems are kind of spindly, but we do currently have a system that can put farmers in touch with each other, of guys who have corn stover to graze and cattle who need some corn stover to graze. Yeah, we're working on trying to get more and more connections with farmers so they can work together kind of as a community to really help each other build up their soils.
Okay, well, perfect. And Tyler, no need to apologize. Those were great questions. So if there are no other questions for Kat, we can go ahead and start wrapping this up. Kat, we just want to thank you again for taking some time out of your Saturday evening to teach us all. I definitely learned a lot on my end, so thank you for that.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a reminder to those participants who are still in here, when you leave the webinar, you will be directed towards a link to take a survey. So if you could fill that out to let us know how this went for you, that information is really helpful for us as we plan these sorts of events for the future. So thank you again, Kat, and we appreciate everyone who hopped on and spent an hour of their Saturday with us. We hope you learned some stuff, and everyone just enjoy the rest of their weekend.